Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt, 34 minutes after the hour, halfway through the Great God Debate with Mark Roberts. Dr. Roberts, author most recently of Can We Trust the Gospel? Christopher Hitchens, author most recently of God Is Not Great. I'm tempted to turn the page, but I don't want to because it's the hardest part of Christopher Hitchens' book, Dr. Mark Roberts, is when he goes to the Old Testament and he finds some awful things. The murder of innocents, the slaying of enemies, the destruction of children, everyone down to the last person in the city. And he presents this as an indictment of the Judeo-Christian ethic. Is he right to do so?
Let me say that I also find that to be one of the hardest things about believing the Bible to be God's Word. There are things in it that I find intuitively contrary to what seems to me to be right and wrong. And some of the things he mentions are things I myself struggle with. My response is twofold. First of all, I have been greatly helped by listening especially to Jewish writers and rabbis talk about some of that material, because there's a lot of it that I don't get as a Christian, and people who live within that tradition are able to make much more sense of it than I. That's number one. The second thing I need to say, though, is that all of that has to be seen in two contexts. Number one, in the context of the culture of that time in history. And many of the things that we see as quite perhaps bizarre or irrational end up making a lot more sense when we understand that culture and the time. For me, the larger point is that what the Old Testament gives us is, you might say, the beginning and the first chapters of the larger story of God's work with us, of God's creation, of the brokenness of the world, of God's effort to mend the world through a very unusual process, that is by entering into relationship with a people and using people to help fix the world. Now, there's a part of me that thinks God wasn't, I wonder sometimes why God gave us the ability to mess it up in the first place. That seems sometimes peculiar. If I were God, I don't know that I would do that, but God, I assume, knows what's best. But secondly, the idea that he's going to use people to bring about the mending of it. And so it's the larger story of the Old Testament that is for me what's most important, in light of which then a lot of the things that seem curious, unexplainable, even offensive, can make sense.
Christopher Hitchens, and one of the things that left me...
You're not going to go on and tell me that there is historical authority for the events described in the New Testament. The Old Testament.
I think
You're
there is...
surely not going to do that.
Well, you did. You said there was a kingdom of David, and you said that there was quite a lot of evidence for the later Israeli or Jewish kingdom.
Yes, there is.
But not for Moses.
A very much smaller kingdom than was thought, very much more modestly sized, and no evidence whatever for the captivity and the exile.
But that was actually one of the parts I thought was a little thin for you, Christopher, because the Jewish archaeological experts that you refer to have not been given access to the same places where their studies have been able to produce the evidences of David.
But they had the strongest motive in the places where they could dig for doing this, and the Sinai's been gone over with a fine-tooth comb by now by a lot of other very highly qualified archaeologists, and there just is no evidence for it at all.
And as those of us involved in the discussion of WMD like to say, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
No, but with WMD you can use the argument from design, because you were dealing with a regime that had possessed and had used and had a record of concealment of WMD, so there's a very fair induction to be made in that case, please.
So, Mark Roberts, what do you say to his response?
Well, the further we go back into ancient history...
I have a question.
Yes, sure.
Sorry. Why does it matter to you to want to adopt these texts, these horrible texts, as your own? Why didn't you just let it go? Why did you just say, it's a pity that St. Paul, in talking, I think, to the Galatians, says, we adopt all these books and these prophecies as our own because we think they were vindicated? Why? How does that make human life better?
Well,
how does it help us to be ethical? Why impose this extraordinary strain on yourself? You're never going to be able to prove it, and you should be relieved.
Never be able to prove the
there's any
historicity,
authenticity, let alone any morality in these horrible old Jewish texts. Why bother? Why adopt them when you could discard them?
Well, I think it's a bit of an exaggeration to say there's no morality in them, but I would agree with your assertion. The further you go back in history, the harder and harder it is to come up with the kind of evidence you talk about. So, you can find evidence of an ancient Jericho, and some scholars think they haven't got evidence that a wall fell over there, but that still is minimal compared to the kind of confirmation that one could get from much more recent kinds of evidence.
Why hang on to it is the question when we return. Christopher Hitchens and Mark Roberts, the guests of the Great God Debate on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt on the Great God Debate Day, special broadcast of the Hugh Hewitt Show. Christopher Hitchens, author of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Dr. Mark Roberts, author most recently of Can We Trust the Gospels? Both books are linked at hughhewitt.com. Dr. Roberts, as we went to break, Christopher Hitchens had said, why not just toss it off? Get rid of the Old Testament or the Jewish scriptures, and you'll be much more. Jefferson could get along with Jesus. Why not just leave it at that?
Well, I would agree it would make certain things easier. Interestingly, this was a great debate within second century Christianity, because there was a man named Marcion who had been apparently an Orthodox Christian and then pretty much decided the Old Testament was much as Christopher Hitchens believes it to be, and he just cut it off and he went into the New Testament and took out all the Old Testament references. And there was a major argument within the early church as to whether one needs, in fact, to hang on to the Old Testament or not. The reasons I would give intellectually are that the Old Testament it's the soil out of which the New Testament was grown, and you need the soil to grow the plant. The personal side of that, I think of a friend of mine named Gary, who grew up as an Orthodox Jew. Some years ago, Gary became a Christian. And as I have been with him as his pastor, one of the things that astounded me almost initially was how much he, having his Jewish background, was able to get and to live the Christian life so much better than people who are Americans not coming out of a Jewish background. For example, Americans who become Christians tend to be incredibly individualistic. Gary intuitively got the fact that being a Christian is about being a member of a community. And so I would argue that it's his closeness to the soil that enables him to be a better believer.
Chris Hitchens, do you admire the work of Walker Percy?
I've read a little, not a great deal. It didn't encourage me to go on to the end.
I bring him up because he was asked once why he was a believer, and he said, I'll stop believing when someone can explain to me the Jews. And now there is a similar passage in your book by a different person, and in fact, there is that extraordinary story of a people formed by that account, as horrific as it is at some points, and as you say, evidence-free in some others, but evidence-filled in others. Does it not strike you that that is an extraordinary story to have come to the full circle back in Jerusalem where they are, were it not for the divine hand upon that people?
Well, as someone who has some Jewish ancestry and a Jewish daughter, and who is indeed very impressed by the survival of the Jewish people and very committed to it, I can't agree with you, no, because if there's been a supervising hand, it's been an extremely brutal one. It's the reason, I think, why so many Jews, I think probably the majority now, are non-believers, or secular in one form or another, or atheist. And why the Jewish contribution to atheism has been so extraordinary, from Spinoza to Einstein.
Mark Roberts?
But, I mean, I'll tell you something. I mean, the rabbi, after the end of the Second World War, the revelation of the final solution, the Shoah, the rabbis went rather quiet. They hadn't got anything much to say about how this had happened or whether God really had done it as a punishment for the exile. The rabbis who did think that would rather kept it to themselves. That's why the Constitution of the State of Israel is as secular as it is. After the 1967 war, which is 40 years ago, as you know, this week, a number of rabbis did start to get up and say, aha, now we see the finger of God. The Holocaust was all meant so this could happen, so that we could establish rule over Arabs. Well, I can't imagine anything more evil being said, or stupid, I have to say.
Well, I don't agree with it either. I don't, in fact, attribute to God the Holocaust.
Please don't say that God is behind all these things.
No,
Why insult your deity by making him responsible?
I don't think he's responsible. I think there's free will in the universe, and that explains how come the Nazis, pagans that they were, went about their vicious ideology and wiped out 6 million people. But that's not my point. My point.
The SS were confessing Catholics.
I agree. I know that, and it's in your book. But paganism, Hitler was not a Christian. Hitler was not a believer in other than Hitler's own.
He never repudiated his church, Hitler.
His church repudiated him.
No, he did not. The Roman Church issued instructions that his birthday was to be celebrated from the pulpit every year till the very end, as you know.
I will simply stand by the point that Hitler is not a Christian, and I don't believe you made that argument in your book.
No, I don't say he was a Christian in my book. I say that he didn't repudiate it, and he certainly